Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're revisiting the Asus ROG Swift PG27AQN to explore its new firmware update that not only provides new Nvidia ULMB 2 backlight strobing functionality, but also optimizes response time performance compared to its initial release. This is one of the bigger firmware updates we've seen for a gaming monitor. It's pretty rare to get entirely new features added through updates like this, but that's what we're getting here thanks to the collaboration between Nvidia and Asus on this monitor. If you're not familiar with the PG27AQN, this is a high-end 27-inch 1440p 360Hz IPS gaming monitor designed for esports competitive play. My full review has all the details on this product and how it performs, though parts of that will be updated today. So if you want to know my full thoughts, it's well worth revisiting that review to see everything including color and HDR performance. Today we're just focusing on the new firmware update and the changes it introduces.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Insta360 and the new Link 4K AI-powered webcam, which has a few neat features. First of all, half-inch sensor, so the image quality that you're seeing here, very good for a little webcam, and excellent audio. The audio is, of course, also coming through the Link. And as you can see, I'm not quite centered correctly, but rather than have to get up there and mess around or adjust any software, I merely just have to make this gesture. Wait a moment. And now we are in follow mode, and that means the webcam will follow me. So if I come over here like that, it'll track me. I can pick up an RTX 4070, show you that. If I put that up there, it'll autofocus very nicely. Put that back down. If I whip over here to show you another RTX 4070, you get the same thing. Come back, and the 3-axis gimbal allows the camera to follow me very nicely. And of course, half-inch sensor, great 4K image, and very impressive audio for a little webcam. I think it's a great product. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
Installing the update is relatively straightforward for some users. You head to the Asus website, download the firmware update executable, follow the instructions provided, and run it on a PC with the display connected over DisplayPort. Unlike many other firmware updates, this update does not require the monitor to be connected over USB. The firmware update is passed to the display over its DisplayPort connection, flashing a few static-like images on screen to do this. Pretty interesting way of updating a monitor, but it's fast and effective. However, it's only possible to update the firmware via an Nvidia GPU. If you have an AMD GPU, the monitor won't be detected and can't be updated. And I know because I tried. This is a pretty crappy limitation given the monitor otherwise works just fine with non-Nvidia GPUs. Adaptive sync functionality works fully on Radeon GPUs, for example, and I'm sure some Radeon GPU owners would have bought or were considering buying a PG27AQN. Those with AMD cards will have to borrow an Nvidia GPU from a mate or something to run the update. Anyway, if you do manage to update the display, you will be treated to improved response time performance. Nvidia and Asus have optimized the AQN using new techniques they told us were based specifically on our gamma-corrected testing methodology, which has also been used by a few other monitor reviewers. It's a better way of doing it. Nvidia recognizes this and has started to implement this sort of optimization for G-Sync products. Previously, under the old firmware, the AQN's performance was biased towards response time speed at the expense of some overshoot. The normal overdrive mode had a greater gray average of 1.96 milliseconds and an inverse ghosting rate of 24.5% at 360 Hz. This level of inverse ghosting increased to 49% using the esports mode and 68% using the extreme mode, which led to some noticeable artifacts using those settings. As such, we recommended most people use the normal mode while gaming. But even the normal mode had a few less than ideal performance characteristics, like increased overshoot at lower refresh rates. Here's 144Hz, for example, showing we were still getting good response times, but with a relatively high inverse ghosting rate. A lot of the time, this level of overshoot wasn't very noticeable, especially at higher refresh rates where the overshoot peak was short and sharp, leading to decent cumulative deviation and an overall fast experience. But given how fast the panel itself is, it wasn't the cleanest optimization and there was really only one overdrive setting that was usable. That has all changed with the new firmware update. The AQN is now much better optimized and as a result performs better, especially for adaptive sync gamers. The main change has been slightly increasing response time performance to significantly reduce overshoot, leading to better cumulative deviation and better performance at lower refresh rates. Here's the normal mode post-update. The average response has increased to 2.56 milliseconds, but what we're now seeing is virtually no overshoot and refresh compliance that's still excellent at 86%. The balance is better here between speed and overshoot, leading to cumulative deviation that's improved from 280 before the update to just 218 after the update, an excellent result. The difference between each overdrive setting has also been reduced in an effort to make these modes more optimized and usable. The esports mode sits at a 2.42 millisecond average response at 360 Hz, but with an average error rate that's fallen from 14% to just 5.5%, again with the corresponding reduction in cumulative deviation. The extreme mode delivers a 2.3 millisecond average response with an average error of 8%, a halving of the error rate under the old firmware, which again leads to a significant cumulative deviation improvement. But what's most impressive is that the extreme mode is now the best choice for adaptive sync gamers across the refresh rate range, that or the esports mode, which is very similar. The only time the average error rate reaches even a moderate level is around 240 Hz. Even down around 144 Hz, 100 Hz, and 60 Hz, we see great use of variable overdrive and some of the best optimized response times I've seen from an LCD. Take 144 Hz as an example. Previously using the normal mode, we saw a 2.68 millisecond average response, 14% average error rate, and average cumulative deviation of 404. Post-update, we get a 3.58 millisecond average, so it is a bit slower, but the error rate has halved to 7.7%, and cumulative deviation improves to 336. The difference is even larger at 60 Hz, giving the AQN a much stronger single overdrive mode experience. What this leads to in actual visual terms is hard to describe, even looking at a UFO test image. At 360 Hz before and after, it's similar at first glance, but on closer inspection, the after result does have some advantages. There's less dark trailing behind the Blurbuster's white text box, some fine edges are more defined, and the darker UFO example at the top is a bit clearer. However, due to the increase in response times, there are some areas that aren't quite as strong, such as the text in the bottom brightest example. That's just at 360 Hz too, where the differences are perhaps least pronounced. In the 240 Hz image, you'll see a bigger improvement to trailing and artifacts post-update, and this continues at lower refresh rates. So where does this leave the PG27AQN in our performance comparison charts? It's good news pretty much across the board. Looking at the best performance at the highest refresh rate and best overdrive settings shows what the update has done to 360 Hz performance. The AQN is now 16% slower, a pretty negligible difference in the grand scheme of things, but the inverse ghosting rate has been slashed to effectively nothing. That's a good trade-off in my opinion and shows better optimization. On average across the refresh rate range, it's a similar improvement and advantage, about 20% slower overall, but a huge reduction in the inverse ghosting rate, which really helps at lower refresh rates and gives the AQN a proper single overdrive mode experience. It also allows this monitor to remain faster than the XL2566K with its TN panel, but now with less overshoot. It's also faster than the fastest VA and much faster and better optimized than the next fastest IPS LCD in this chart. With better optimization comes a better balance between speed and overshoot, and this really helps out cumulative deviation. In our testing on average, the update has improved cumulative deviation by 41%, with particularly strong gains at lower refresh rates. The gain at 360 Hz is 30%, but this grows to a near 2x improvement at 60 Hz, which is significant and quite visible in practice. This takes the AQN ahead of the XL2566K in this test, and I'd say this is noticeable when looking at UFO tests. As I mentioned, some of the larger gains were to lower refresh rates, and this is what we see. The AQN ends up delivering an excellent experience for an LCD at 120 Hz, but the difference at 60 Hz is massive. Previously, we recommended reducing the overdrive level to off for 60 Hz gaming, but that's no longer necessary. The extreme mode is just fine. This results in an improvement from a 6.13 millisecond average to a 3.62 millisecond average with negligible overshoot. That's very significant and makes the AQN one of the best LCDs for lower refresh rate gaming, despite its primary focus being 360 Hz. The second part of the firmware update is the introduction of ULMB 2. ULMB, or ultra-low motion blur, is Nvidia's backlight strobing tech implementation used with their G-Sync monitors, the ones with a full G-Sync module. This tech has other variations and forms, often with brand names like ULMB from Asus in their non-G-Sync monitors, or DIAC from BenQ. It's ULMB for Nvidia G-Sync. ULMB 2 introduces a few improvements compared to the older ULMB tech. Nvidia are mandating ULMB2 at the monitor's highest refresh rate, something that wasn't always possible with previous ULMB monitors. You might only get strobing at 120Hz on a 240Hz monitor as an example. They're also requiring 250 nits of brightness with minimal crosstalk or double images, and they are using something called vertical dependent overdrive to improve the clarity of strobing at the top and bottom of the monitor, which are usually less clear compared to the center when strobing is enabled. Vertical dependent overdrive changes the level of overdrive applied to each pixel depending on their position in the scan-out. Their chart suggests less overdrive at the top of the monitor, more at the bottom, to try and sync up the timing inside the optimal strobe position. On top of all of this, Nvidia also spent a bit of time talking about ULMB2 delivering over 1000 Hz of effective motion clarity. Without the actual ability to compare a ULMB2 screen to a 1000 Hz screen, as 1000 Hz monitors don't exist yet, this is just a bit of marketing BS right now as far as I'm concerned. There's no capability here that indicates only ULMB2 would deliver this either, versus something like DIAC Plus on BenQ monitors, which already provides excellent motion clarity and a huge improvement over a non-strobed image. I get that with this marketing, Nvidia trying to illustrate the advantage of using ULMB2 strobing over non-strobing, but it's not something I'll be referencing or really talking about all that much. It's also worth mentioning that ULMB2 does not work with adaptive sync or G-Sync simultaneously. This is for fixed refresh rates only, as it's much harder to get both technologies working together at the same time with acceptable levels of quality. Very similar to what we see from other premium strobing implementations, and there's no 60Hz strobing support here either. With ULMB2, it's easy to enable. You just disable G-Sync in the Nvidia control panel, then enable ULMB2 in the monitor's OSD. There's a single control option for pulse width with options between 100 and 10. 100 is brighter and less clear, 10 is very dim and has the best clarity. You can see the differences here, which I think are relatively small. 50 provides a good balance between clarity and usable brightness. At pulse width 100, I measured 252 nits of brightness, so just above Nvidia's threshold, 120 nits at 50, while it's just 21 nits at 10, which is not very usable in practice. When looking at the middle of the screen, the clarity provided by ULMB2 is impressive. At 360Hz, the native image has pretty good motion clarity, but still a bit of blur introduced by sample and hold. The 360Hz ULMB2 image is much clearer, the blurbuster's text is readable, there is some but largely minimal strobe crosstalk, and fine details are easy to make out. This is among the better performing strobing modes that I've seen. ULMB2 also works very well at lower refresh rates like 144Hz with a huge improvement to motion clarity. There is some red fringing here on the AQN due to the backlight being used, but it's less visible than some implementations I've seen. Still, bit of an annoying artifact given the otherwise great quality and minimal strobe crosstalk. It's just the reality of this hardware limitation. Not something specific to ULMB2, of course. Red fringing will not be seen on other ULMB2 monitors that use a different backlight technology. What I was less convinced of is vertical dependent overdrive improving strobe clarity at the top and bottom of the screen. On the PG27AQN, the top is actually the clearest with ULMB2 enabled. It looks great there, but the bottom of the screen still suffers from noticeable strobe crosstalk and blur. We'll look at a comparison to another monitor in a moment, but ULMB2 does not seem to be a perfect solution to the issue where strobing quality differs depending on the area of the screen you're looking at. It might widen the area of usable clarity and make it easier to optimize, but it's unfortunately not a revolutionary fix that delivers identical image quality across the entire screen. The big question mark is how good is ULMB2 overall compared to other strobing tech, and particularly the best. So let's take a look up against the XL2566K and its DIAC Plus mode, which up to this point has been the class leader. This is a very interesting comparison from several standpoints. The first is brightness. ULMB2, at least on the PG27AQN, is not as bright as the XL2566K's DIAC Plus mode. The BenQ monitor runs at 330 nits max for the quality seen here, whereas the AQN maxes out at 120 nits for pulse width 50, which I've used here. This Asus monitor can only reach around 250 nits best case, which is still a lot lower than the BenQ, and the clearest mode on offer with ULMB2 is an order of magnitude less bright. Hopefully other monitors will be able to deliver higher levels of brightness, more in line with the BenQ when using ULMB2, but at least we do get that 250 nit minimum. As for actual visual quality, using the UFO test as an example, ULMB2 is quite competitive. Strobe crosstalk and double images trade blows depending on which area of the image I look at. There's fewer artifacts behind the UFO on the ULMB2 side, but fine details are clearer on the Diac Plus side, and the BenQ monitor has no red fringing. At 144Hz, it's a similar story. The BenQ has more obvious trailing and overshoot behind the UFO, but is clearer for some elements like the lines inside the red UFO body. These are almost nitpicks though. Both technologies deliver very good motion clarity under a range of circumstances, so clearly ULMB2 is right up there in terms of quality. What I was pleased to see is that ULMB2 beats Diac Plus for clarity at the top and bottom of the screen, suggesting that while vertical dependent overdrive isn't a perfect fix, it does improve the situation versus other technologies. The Asus monitor has fewer artifacts at the top of the screen, and the bottom is slightly clearer, although neither it or the BenQ monitor look great in that area. It's good to see Nvidia acknowledging this is a limitation of backlight strobing and coming up with a way to improve it though, and I think with a different panel tech like TN, we might see even further optimizations to this issue. After all, we are comparing IPS to TN here, and the latest TNs go up to 500 plus hertz. A major downside though is that ULMB2 currently doesn't work with AMD GPUs, sort of. It's a bit of an interesting issue because when you don't install the Radeon driver or use your PC in safe mode, which uses the generic Windows display driver, ULMB2 actually can be enabled on an AMD GPU. But with the proper Radeon drivers installed, like pretty much anyone would use, ULMB2 cannot be enabled as far as I can tell. Now before you say, well that's suspicious, is the monitor detecting the AMD GPU and blocking ULMB2 access? No, that's not what is happening. What's actually happening is that ULMB2 requires adaptive sync to be disabled for the option to appear. On Nvidia GPUs, that's possible through their control panel. You uncheck the G-Sync box and the display reverts to operating in a non-VRR mode. ULMB2 is then visible and it all works nicely. On an AMD GPU, there is no way to fully disable adaptive sync and get the monitor to run in this non-VRR mode, so the ULMB2 setting is always grayed out. And no, disabling adaptive sync in Radeon software for this monitor does not fix this problem because it doesn't fully disable adaptive sync. That toggle keeps the monitor running in the same mode, it just stops all variable refresh functionality, so it runs in a fixed refresh state. It doesn't tell the monitor to exit the adaptive sync mode, at least as far as I can tell that's how it works, and so it doesn't run using the non-VRR mode. However, when using the monitor with generic Windows display drivers, there is no adaptive sync support, and so the display runs in the non-VRR mode, which is why ULMB2 in those circumstances is then available. Bit of a quirk in the way AMD handles adaptive sync and implements its toggle that rarely causes any other issues, but causes this incompatibility here. I believe ULMB2 would work with Radeon GPUs and other devices for that matter. It would just require one of two things. Either AMD needs to implement a toggle in their driver that fully disables adaptive sync support and runs monitors in their non-VRR mode, or Asus need to implement an OSD setting that disables adaptive sync. A lot of monitors do have that OSD setting, so that might be the easier way to make ULMB2 work across more devices. With that said, this firmware was largely produced by Nvidia, who have zero incentive to get ULMB2 working on other GPUs, and you can't even install the update without an Nvidia GPU anyway. Aside from the lack of support for non-Nvidia GPUs, this firmware update to the PG27AQN is quite impressive, and ULMB2 looks to be a strong feature. The way Asus and Nvidia have optimized overdrive takes this panel and overall performance to the next level, and continues to show the importance of both optimization and variable overdrive. Without fine attention to detail and implementing cutting-edge features, other LCDs won't be able to compete, so I hope all monitor brands take notice. ULMB2 also looks to be one of the best backlight strobing implementations on the market, delivering visual quality similar to other class leaders such as BenQ's Diac Plus. I like that Nvidia are mandating good levels of brightness and support for maximum refresh rate strobing with ULMB2, as that will lead to better and more usable implementations, while the actual visual quality is very good. Vertical dependent overdrive doesn't appear to be a total success, but does offer a small improvement compared to some other strobing technologies for those areas at the top and bottom of the screen. While ULMB2 is very good visually, I wouldn't say it's obviously ahead of tech like Diac Plus. It's still going to be a situation where each monitor's strobing technology will need to be assessed and compared. So don't get sucked into thinking you must have ULMB2 in your next monitor. Check reviews to see where things lie. There are still areas of improvement for all of these technologies. Anyway, that's it for this revisit of the PG27AQN and its firmware update. If you do own this monitor and you have an Nvidia GPU, I would highly recommend installing this firmware update. It does improve the experience, and I think ULMB2 is at least worth experimenting with, especially with an esports monitor where you're more likely to want to use, a backlight strobing technology for that advantage in competitive games. If you do appreciate our independent testing and analysis of features like this, then please do subscribe to Monitors Unboxed for more testing like this, or consider supporting us directly through Patreon or Floatplane. We have links in the description below. You'll gain access to some cool benefits and perks like our Discord community, which is a great place to chat about monitors, get recommendations, all that sort of thing. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.